Yeah, I mean, somebody said that 60% of the electricity in Ireland is being used for Bitcoin, which is kind of shocking. But I do see some innovation coming down the pike that may actually, change the efficiency. But Bitcoin actually is the sort of grandfather of all of this innovation, and there are many, many different protocols that have come as a result of that. I mean, if you listen to some of the talks about the sort of new fork that they had in November for Ethereum, it talks a bit about moving to a proof of stake in order to conserve energy. And there's a number of other protocols that are underway to more efficiently mine without having to use so much energy. But I think that Bitcoin actually was the grandfather to all this innovation, and it will have some staying power. But yeah, it does take up a lot of energy.
Anybody else want to respond?
I think it's spot on. I think ultimately there's another play, right? You invest in tech companies were investing in ASIC cards when Bitcoin was the new kid on the block, as we use the grandfather analogy, and as I think we move to things like proof of stake, GPUs will take over. So there's another, if you want to think about an investment opportunity, think about GPU production versus ASIC production. But I do think that there are other consensus protocols out there that will show themselves to be more efficient, kind of the planet, and just as effective. So I think we're in the early days of like consensus protocols that work for public networks.
Yeah, I think those are great explanations, but I think it's worth taking a step back. Just say why is this activity necessary at all, and does that apply to all blockchains? So blockchain is, I think there have been kind of at least three major innovations. There's kind of these efficient digital currencies that can operate in a decentralized way. There's the idea of a distributed ledger or blockchain, and then there's these kind of tokenized asset offerings. So when it comes to blockchain, the mechanism that's used in Bitcoin to validate transactions is that you have all these miners who are competing, and there's an arms race of rapid computing power that does consume energy to prove these things. But blockchain can also be used for other types of applications and is being used by banks, by exchanges, by insurance companies, by all sorts of, it's being used in healthcare and in music and other intellectual property. So blockchains are being used, and even though the original kind of Bitcoin blockchain is this decentralized public blockchain that anybody can access, there's no central authority who grants permission. Blockchain technology is being used in lots of places. It's being tested to give identity to refugees, and in many of these other applications of blockchain, which are not the Bitcoin blockchain, you don't have this massive energy consumption to use it. So blockchain technology, sometimes called distributed ledger technology, is being used in all sorts of innovation around the world. And this whole energy consumption issue is not even relevant because they're private or they're centrally operated. There's a central authority, and that sort of eliminates the requirement for this. Now, the reason that in Bitcoin blockchain you need this was that Bitcoin was invented, and this is part of the genius of Bitcoin, to solve a very specific problem, which is that if you have a digital asset that we can send to one another, how do we solve the double spending problem? I could just copy and paste it and send it to everybody in this room. And how do you know I haven't just sent the same Bitcoin that I sent to you to 200 other people who are sitting here? So, and what Bitcoin was also trying to solve was, instead of having a centralized network like the central bank and sovereign governments that at the time of financial crisis were so mistrusted by the inventors of Bitcoin, how do you have a decentralized network that anybody can access where there's no restrictions on permission, and how do we still prevent double spending? And how do we prevent creation of these fraudulent Bitcoins? And so that's what this whole proof of work consensus mechanism was designed to solve, that in a decentralized mechanism where anybody can access the network, including bad and malicious actors. There's a mechanism to validate the transactions that can make it safe for the entire network to use.
So I just wanted to add to that, because talking about the private networks, which are actually used a lot to facilitate frenemies trying to share data, you may not even have more than 12 nodes, and they're private. And so you don't have this energy consumption issue there. Hyperledger, which actually is used by IBM and R3 and a number of other companies, is really just a workflow blockchain. And they've argued you can put an economic layer, but they don't have any coins or economic layer. It's all about workflow and trust and visibility and compliance. So when you hear blockchain, not all of it has a coin associated with it. And there's hundreds of versions of private blockchains out there.
Last point on, because I want to make sure you all walk out with this, because you use the word blockchain and DLT ubiquitously, and they're actually, it's probably worth explaining what the difference is. But also, the word my colleagues in the panel are describing is consensus, and machine proof of work, proof of stake are just forms of consensus. Private blockchains don't need to use those forms of consensus. Most of the things that we work on uses something called BFT, Byzantine fault tolerant. You can have various implementations of Byzantine fault tolerant. It's a protocol. And an example of it would be, let's say there are 200 people in this room, and we all are on a blockchain together. We all know each other. We're all friends. And I say, the next transaction is going to be the hash of 2 + 2. And I randomly pick somebody that nobody knows I'm going to pick. I'm going to pick that Jeffrey. Jeffrey's going to tell us what the answer is. Wonderful. We all agreed it was 4. We all worked out it was 4, and we add it. And then we do exactly the same thing with another transaction. It's 3 + 3. I'm going to go to Eric, because I can see his name. And Eric says, I'm going to ask Eric. Eric says it's 5. And 299 people in the room knew the answer was 6. We're all running the same software. Something must have been up with Eric. So we vote him off our island. We replay the transaction. We get 6. Mm-hmm. And he can't rejoin our network until we figured out what went wrong. Right, because that's how in a private network we can do that. The reason why that protocol, BFT, doesn't work in an unpermissioned way is because if I'm a bad actor, all I've got to do is fire up 2/3. I'm going to fire up 500 additional machines behind us, make them up. And now I'm going to, because I can't predict which one of us was going to be the next person to be picked to add the next transaction. And so that's why in a private world, that works really well, provided we can keep the borders closed. And it's very efficient. It's not as efficient as an exchange. It can never be, because we're all keeping asking ourselves, did you get 4? Did you get 6? Those confirmations take time. But it's actually, from a settlement perspective, incredibly efficient and is a game changer for what we're trying to do within funded services.
And I was just going to say something very, very quickly, which is just to keep it into perspective, and I don't have the figures in front of me, but a friend of mine had done some sort of comparison of the cost of mining gold, right, versus the cost of mining Bitcoin. So, gold is expensive too in terms of energy costs.